Hey, Al Scott here. If you've got a band, a business, a cause, or campaign, and you need stickers to help promote, check out thebumpersticker.com at thebumpersticker.com. They digitally print with solvent ink, so you get the photo quality results of digital with the strength and durability of old-style screen printing. I'm sure glad I sold thebumpersticker.com to Rick back when. He's made a hell of a great company out of it, and there are thousands of satisfied customers who agree with me, too. Let thebumpersticker.com help you get the word out. That's thebumpersticker.com at thebumpersticker.com. All right, y'all, Scott Horton Show. ScottHorton.org is the website with all the archives. More than 4,000-something interviews now going back to 2003 there. ScottHorton.org. Sign up for the podcast feed and all that. And follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. Introducing Rick Sterling. He is an investigative journalist and a member of the Syria Solidarity Movement. And here he's got this very important piece at Bob Perry's site, consortiumnews.com. All the best Syria stuff is there, man. And this one is called Propaganda for Syrian Regime Change. Welcome to the show, Rick. How are you?
All right. Hi, Scott. Good to be here.
Good. Very happy to have you here. Now, the reason I wanted to have you on about this show is I really learned something, I think, from this piece. I guess I've been wanting to believe that somehow the Americans, if they can be oversimplified as one group, I guess the Obama White House has decided they don't want regime change against Assad. After all, the Russians called their bluff back at the end of last year when Damascus finally really became threatened by al-Qaeda forces, and our bluff was called. We had to back down. We're now even having trial balloons about working with Russia to bomb the al-Nusra Front as well as the Islamic State, even though apparently that's not going anywhere for now. And, of course, I do see at the same time that Hillary Clinton and her cabinet in waiting are much more hawkish, and they're putting out their trial balloons as well. But what really struck me was you've done a real encyclopedic kind of effort here of going down all of the latest indications that the policy of getting rid of Assad and maybe even the entire Ba'athist government in Damascus still stands. And you know, almost unbelievably, and I guess I should ask as part of that, still stands amongst whom? Because I don't know if you include Obama in that or who all is part of this consensus according to you, but this is now the time where I give you the floor and you let them have it and show what it is you're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we are in a very dangerous period here right now. Unfortunately, there was no change in U.S. foreign policy under the Obama administration. And the tip-off to that occurred right at the start when he appointed Hillary Clinton as the Secretary of State, and then the same thing in economic affairs. There was a clear indication that this was not going to really be, change we can believe in. So Obama he's kind of moderated the most hawkish elements when Washington was clamoring for the U.S. to attack Syria directly in August of 2013. Obama realized that was going to be a bad move, and especially in the wake of the disaster in Libya, he basically did not go along with the Washington game plan then. Unfortunately, he's never asserted a different foreign policy by appointing people who would implement different policy. So we have the neocons still effectively running things and pushing, and he kind of drags his heels a little bit, which gets the neoconservatives and the right wing, the Washington Post, and even the New York Times has actually joined the neocon group in many ways. He frustrates them, and they're now champing at the bit for Hillary Clinton to come into the White House. It's definitely Obama's foreign policy involves a lot of double dealing, saying one thing and then doing another. So you've got Kerry having negotiations with Lavrov. I was seeing on PBS NewsHour last night that they're claiming that John Kerry has a good relation with Sergei Lavrov. But I don't know how good it could be, because despite their negotiations, the U.S. never follows through and carries out or implements the agreements that they come up with. So, for example, they came up with an agreement for a ceasefire back in February of this year, and yet the U.S. couldn't get any of the groups to sit at the negotiating table. And then a couple of 6 weeks ago, we had a temporary ceasefire around Aleppo, and the armed groups used it to bring in huge quantities of new weapons, which, by the way, were U.S. weapons. 994 tons of sophisticated weapons and ammunition were delivered to the extremists and the so-called moderate rebels in Syria last winter. So a huge amount of that was brought into Aleppo to resupply the terrorist groups that are operating in sections of East Aleppo. So it's, I think what we've seen is a lot of basically double dealing, and now they are stalling for trying to prevent the Syrian government and allies from crushing the terrorists which are embedded in sections of East Aleppo.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, so I guess the battle in East Aleppo right now has been portrayed by some as maybe the last gasp for the jihadist CIA and Turkish, Saudi, etc. backed forces there. What do you think of that? Are they going to live to fight another day after they lose this one?
Well, it's interesting. That is the hope. That's what Syrians hope will happen, that the terrorists can be crushed, eliminated, driven out of Aleppo, and that after they repair the services there, you would have hundreds of thousands of civilians returning. The media here does not portray the reality. They talk about Aleppo. They talk about it as though it's an area with a huge number of civilians. That's not true. Even Martin Chulov from The Guardian visited the terrorist-held area of Aleppo last year, and his estimate was 40,000. So these estimates of hundreds of thousands of civilians being in the terrorist rebel sections of Aleppo are grossly exaggerated. There was a doctor who went into there, an American doctor, and he described it as a ghost town. So that's actually the most prevalent description of the rebel terrorist held sections of cities is their ghost towns. The civilians all depart.
Yeah, and all flee to government held territory for a modicum of safety.
Right. And what does that tell us? So your question, but going back to your important question, is we're at a critical time here where the armed factions are losing their supply, their continuous supply of new fighters and weapons. That has shifted in the last year, because Turkey is starting to close off the border to some extent. It's not consistent, but the days where foreign recruits to join Nusra al-Qaeda in Syria, ISIS, and so forth can just freely pass through Turkey and then enter Syria and join up with one or another of the terrorist factions. Those days are over. So it's not so easy for them to get new recruits anymore. And also Western countries, Belgium, France, the UK, Canada, foreign countries in the West as well as North Africa, that previously you had hundreds and thousands of recruits coming from those areas. That source is also drying up, because Western countries, now that they've felt some of the sting of terrorism and killing in their own countries, they are finally starting to crack down on it. So you've had the arrest in the UK just in the last month. You had a guy who had been basically almost a spokesman for ISIS finally being arrested and convicted. In Canada, they're no longer looking the other way, as deluded, brainwashed young Canadians get recruited and travel to Turkey and then into Syria. So the Canadian Security Intelligence Services is finally cracking down on that and arresting people. Previously, they would not. They just looked the other way. So the point is that in the past, you had a steady stream of new recruits for the terrorist groups coming from countries all around the world. From China, you had Uyghurs. They led one huge battle a year and a half ago. They were the spearhead of it. Chinese Uyghurs. You had whole battle groups from Malaysia, from Indonesia. So it's quite astounding how many people from around the world, basically brainwashed individuals and to some extent mercenaries as well, because they're being paid salaries.
Yeah, I remember back in, I'll guess 2012 or 2013, where we were laughing about how Afghan jihadis were traveling to Syria. Why take on the Marine Corps when you can have America support you in your exact same war 1,000 miles to the west?
Yeah, crazy.
That's unbelievable. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, bad. Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria, all right. Let's help these guys win their heroic rebellion against the Ba'athist government there.
Exactly. And Scott, I think one of the really important and underreported elements here is the role and the influence of Israel in all this. Some analysts have said that, well, Israel's not that concerned. The Golan Heights border, the disputes between Syria and Israel, they were a thing of the past, that it was a quiet area there. Israel, of course, occupies the Golan Heights, which is Syrian territory, but Syria hasn't challenged them militarily. So some analysts have said, well, Israel's not really that concerned. It's just Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Qatar with the West. But I think that's totally incorrect. Israel has bombed in Syria over the last several years, several times. They've attacked Syrian aircraft when they were getting ready to attack Nusra terrorists up in southern Syria near the Golan Heights. Israel has provided medical treatment to Syrian terrorist groups. There's a video of Benjamin Netanyahu along the bedside of one of the rebel terrorists. As well, the policy of dividing and conquering and continues, and a big driving force for Israel, of course, is to attack Hezbollah, the Lebanese resistance in southern Lebanon. And Hezbollah is an ally of Syria, and they are both allies of Iran, and that gives a very strong motive to Zionist Israel to attack, to see a destabilized, disempowered Syria, and perhaps a broken up and fragmented and chaotic Syria that cannot be a threat to it, and which would facilitate Israel being able to attack Hezbollah more easily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, old big mouth Michael Oren likes to make a habit out of admitting this. When he was still the ambassador, and then shortly after leaving his position as ambassador. And in fact, of course, the best clip, and it's redundant on this show, but I'll go ahead and mention it in case anybody doesn't know. It's just the simplest search terms in the world. Oren, O-R-E-N, Michael Oren. Just type in Oren Sunnis. And up comes him explaining to Jeffrey Goldberg, just 1 week after the declaration of the caliphate in Mosul, that we prefer the Sunni evil to the Shia evil because the Shia evil is backed by Iran. And then he lies and says, and they have military nuclear technology is his justification. And Assad is responsible for all the deaths on all sides of the war. That's the other excuse. And so, and he makes explicit reference to ISIS and says, yeah, my God, they just executed 1,700 men in the field, referring to the Iraqi Air Force cadets that had all been machine gunned to death in the parking lot and on video on YouTube. And he goes, yeah, but still, they're not backed by Iran, so we like them better. Simple as that. And even Jeffrey Goldberg is left sputtering and saying, hey, you ain't speaking for me on that one, pal. Sorry, because, I live in New York. So, the whole piles of dead bodies thing.
Right. Oren, we have to actually be grateful to Michael Oren because he really, he puts it very succinctly and frankly.
He could have made reference to the mythical moderates or something, but he didn't bother. He went, the worst of them? Yeah, no, they're still better than Hezbollah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, there's actually a long-standing Israeli strategy of destabilizing its neighbors and attempting to break them up using sectarianism, promoting sectarianism, just as Israel did. Israel, of course, initially provided assistance and funding to Hamas when it began, because at that time the nationalist elements with Marxist elements was the strongest force in the Palestinian resistance, and Israel used sectarianism and promoted the sectarian Islamism to weaken its enemy, just as the U.S. was working with Saudi Arabia in Afghanistan to destabilize the situation there. It was a strategy that they used in Afghanistan, the Israelis used in Palestine, and it's continued today.
Yeah. I don't know, I guess you want to go ahead and talk about the clean break and coping with crumbling states, or are you going back as far as, well, let me ask you how consistent this policy is, because of course, there's the Oded Yanon plan, but there's also, as Eric Margulies likes to point out, that Jabotinsky talked about this kind of thing back at the dawn of Zionism 100 years ago as well.
Right. Yeah. Actually, Scott, I think it would be useful to talk about Bernie Sanders. In the article, I make some pointed comments and suggestions about Bernie Sanders and his failure to be addressing this issue. How about if we take that up?
Go right ahead, sure.
Scott, one thing that I believe is important here is that we develop a strong resistance to this regime change policy. We're in a very dangerous situation here. The U.S. could start attacking Syria directly, and there's a real risk of that ending up involving Russia and Iran as well. This is something that is extremely dangerous, and we basically need all progressive groups in the country to get on board with this and stop it. Now, I was a supporter of Bernie Sanders when he was running to be the nominee. And the big issue for me is foreign policy, and Sanders didn't say much about it, but the little he did say was pretty good, which just boiled down to we need to end the regime change policy that the U.S. has followed for decades now, because we've seen how disastrous that is, whether it's Libya or Iraq or any other place that the U.S. has done that. Bernie Sanders didn't say much, as I was saying, but what he said was pretty good. It made sense. Now is the time when he needs to be speaking up, and at this period when Clinton, is not president, but it looks like more likely than not she will become president. Well, if Bernie Sanders is going to have any measurable progressive impact on things, he has to be raising his voice and letting it be really clear and known that he will not support that, and he will be very active campaigning against it. He can also play a huge role by educating more of the people about the dangers here. Sanders still has a following. He basically got 46% of the vote in a rigged
let me ask you
Democratic
something,
Party
though.
system.
You think he even really knows about this stuff, much less cares? He just doesn't even care about this stuff.
I think he does, actually.
I mean, they ask him about the wars, and he goes, oh, yeah, the drone wars against the terrorist guys? Yeah, we're going to do that. Oh, ISIS? Yeah. Well, you know what we'll do? First we'll fight ISIS, and then we'll fight Assad. And you know that it's not like he has conviction here. He's just trying to figure out what is he supposed to say to be not quite as bad as her, but still be bad enough to be tolerable to people with power, right?
Well,
it ain't like he's Ron Paul up there who actually knows what he's talking about and cares.
Well, I think Sanders does know. Why he doesn't say more, I don't know. And you're right that sometimes he sounded okay, sometimes he didn't. I mean, at one point he said we should work with Russia to deal with ISIS. Another time I heard him say, yeah, well, we'll deal with ISIS now and then we'll deal with Assad later.
Well, and then sometimes he says we ought to have the Saudis send in their field army to Iraqi Sunnistan to liberate Mosul. And at that point, every last person in the room wonders, what in the world is this guy even talking about? If the Saudis, if they even had an army besides ours, and they were doing anything but killing Yemenis with it, and they were invading Iraqi Sunnistan, it would be to prop up the Islamic State, not to fight against it. And what is this crazy old man even referring to? Nobody even knows. You know? Saudi needs to start getting their hands dirty over there. Yeah, their hands are plenty dirty over there. They've been backing the Sunni insurgency in Iraq since America invaded for Iran.
Well, they've got the Saudis have their hands full in Yemen right now, which they thought was going to be a cakewalk, and it's turned into just the opposite for them. And part of the complication there is that, you know, some of their ground forces are Yemeni, and they're not too enthusiastic about invading their own, you know, their own homeland for Saudi Arabia. But well, in any event, I think it's important to talk about Sanders and to press him to do what he did. He was you're right, there were contradictions in some of the things he said, and he spoke relatively little about it, but frequently what he said was spot on. We need to stop and change the regime change policy. That's it in a nutshell. And that's what we've got going on here right now. We've got.
Well, I guess my point there is that's not really different than Ted Cruz or Rand Paul. Their position is, yes, fight the terrorists, but no, let's stop overthrowing secular dictatorships. Okay, I mean, as far as it goes, is Ted Cruz better than Marco Rubio on that? I guess he is. But that's not non-interventionism. That's not really trying to even figure out a way to end the war. That's the status quo. I mean, Barack Obama backed down on Assad in 2013, after all. So that would be picking up where Obama left off, wouldn't it? Drone wars everywhere. And I see what you mean. When compared to Hillary Clinton, the man's a saint. But in real life, he's just a Democrat senator, right?
Well, I guess he didn't. He actually wasn't elected as a Democrat, but I guess I would like to. I think it's more productive and more potentially productive is perhaps a better way to put it. To press him to campaign for a more enlightened, a much better foreign policy, especially since we're on the cusp of a huge disaster here.
Yeah.
And
well, I mean, but from his point of view, that could hurt her in the face of Donald Trump, and he didn't want to do anything that'll help Donald Trump at this point.
Yeah, that's kind of. I mean, you've got all of Wall Street, you've got all of the neocons behind Hillary Clinton. She doesn't need.
Well, I agree with you. Don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying from his point of view, like today, in fact, Trump put out a thing using a Sanders quote saying that super predator is a racist term, and she knew it was a racist term. And so Donald Trump goes, you know, Sanders is the perfect weapon to use against her from his point of view, and Sanders must regret that and lament that and want to not help create any more of those talking points, you know, bad judgment and all that.
Yeah, I guess strategically, I think we should take Bernie Sanders. We should push Bernie Sanders, press him to do some progressive things, as much as we can. Now, you know, you're a little more cynical about it than I am, but I think if there's a chance we can get him to do something, we should take that. We should take that chance and and push as much as we can, because
sure, I agree with that. And I don't. I'm sorry too, by the way, because I actually do think that he is a better man than probably any other senator that you could name. So I don't think he's, and I hate his economics. I'm a libertarian, but just in terms of whether he's a backstabbing SOB kind of guy, the way most of these are, I disagree with his votes a lot, but I don't think that he's, that bad.
Right. Now, this ties in with the Israel issue as well. Of course, it was, much publicized that Hillary Clinton is adamantly pro Israel, and Bernie Sanders made the most tepid disagreement possible, but that was still cause for much publicity, because Sanders at least said, well, we have to have some respect for Palestinians as well. It's not just a question of being pro-Israel. We have to be we have to support decent conditions and human rights for Palestinians as well as Israelis. I think one of the driving issues here is actually Israel. And it's Hillary Clinton's devotion to the Zionist state of Israel, which is going to lead her into U.S. aggression in Syria. And it's going to lead, the danger is, as the Syrian government and allies get closer and closer to destroying and crushing the armed groups that are operating there, the potential or the danger is that Clinton and the neocons are going to do something desperate to force the U.S. or to basically drag the U.S. into the conflict to prevent an Assad victory. And that, again, is an area where Sanders has a little more rationality about Israel. He doesn't have that blind devotion to all things Israel that Clinton does.
Yeah. I kind of have I'll make a note and talk to you about this after the show. I sort of have an idea on the Sanders thing. But I shouldn't say for the interview's sake. But so let's go back to some of this. This is sort of where we started with this interview. There's all these indications of the Hillary war cabinet in waiting and just how far they're willing to go, apparently quite a bit further than they've been able to get Obama to go. And you list some of these. The State Department letter we've talked about on the show. The letter from the doctors I had missed. And of course there's the Michelle Flournoy trial balloons that have come out as well. So I guess if you could just catch people up on that, what we know about these mostly not very famous people who wield so much foreign policy authority in D.C. and what they're proposing.
So you're asking for the people, like
about you mentioned
or?
Dennis Ross and you mentioned Michelle Flournoy and all this. So I guess I was just saying, kind of give you more of an opportunity to paint a picture of who Hillary's war cabinet is and what it is that they want here.
Right. Well, some of the voices that have come out here are right after it became clear, right after Hillary Clinton supposedly won California, and it was pretty widely accepted that she would be the Democratic nominee. Then very soon after that, you had the New York Times giving a lot of publicity to a group of State Department officials who were voicing their disagreement with the current policy of not attacking Syria. It's a pretty amazing thing that you've got State Department officials who supposedly are diplomats, expressly calling for a military attack on a sovereign state. So that was pretty astounding. And then soon after that, you had Dennis Ross, who was worked with Bill Clinton, and who was a favorite of Hillary Clinton. Dennis Ross was Hillary Clinton's selected person to deal with Iran, was the way she put it in her book. making writing an op-ed with Andrew Tabler, the case for finally bombing Assad. So you've got this. You've got basically people openly calling for an attack on a sovereign state, violation of international law, obviously, with nobody kind of even raising an eyebrow. And this is being published in the New York Times, which of course is the preeminent U.S. newspaper. So it used to have some distinction from the Washington Post, which was more conservative. But it seems like the New York Times has moved in the direction of the Washington Post rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
So in the last week, we've had PBS NewsHour do a promo piece for the White Helmets. For listeners who don't know, the White Helmets have received quite a bit of publicity and are presented as being this wonderful grassroots Syrian civil defense group, which performs rescue operations after bombing attacks. It's actually a creation of the UK and the US. It's been funded, created. The initial trainees were brought to Turkey, and they were trained by a British military contractor, and they've received a ton of money from the US as well. They received $18 million last year. So, and as well, the group, unlike the Red Crescent and the Red Cross, they actually do work on both sides of a conflict. The White Helmets only work with the terrorist rebels, and they work primarily in the zones that are controlled by Jabhat al-Nusra, the Al-Qaeda franchise in Syria. There's even one interesting video where you see the terrorists execute somebody, and then the White Helmets show up and put them on a stretcher and take them away. And then there's other examples where you see people with their White Helmets uniform, the white helmet, and then a jacket, and then they're carrying weapons. Well, supposedly they're unarmed, they're neutral, they're independent. All of those things are untrue. But meanwhile, we've got PBS NewsHour doing a promo piece for it, and mentioning that they've been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize of all things. One of the members of Syria Solidarity Movement, Vanessa Beeley's done a lot of great research on the White Helmets, and we've got a Change.org petition saying do not give the White Helmets a Nobel Peace Prize. And our Change petition actually has more signatures than more people signing up than the one that proposes to give them a Nobel Peace Prize, so we're happy about that. But much more work needs to be done to expose these groups. Now,
I'm sorry to interrupt right here, but it's just so apropos. Right now in my Twitter feed is the picture of the young Syrian boy caked in blood and dust.
Yeah.
And
yes.
The quote is, "Never again must we be shy in the face of the evidence. Clinton on Rwanda, 1998. And it's being retweeted around by the liberals. Note to Obama and Ambassador Power.
Yeah.
We must look at this boy bleeding and in pain, and your thought, supposedly, your knee jerk is supposed to be, by God, we must escalate this war, rather than what is Obama doing to call a damn peace conference and get this thing settled peacefully now?
Yeah. Well, in the New York Times today, there's a lengthy piece which has got the theme that the Syrian civil war is what they call it, is nowhere near over. It can only get worse, and it can only drag on. And I guess the unspoken message there is, Obama should do something to stop it. But that's exactly what they like. In contrast with that, the Syrian conflict could be over very, very rapidly, actually, if the countries who have been funding and supplying the armed terrorist groups in violation of international law and the UN Charter, if they were to stop doing that, the conflict would very rapidly end. So that's what we really need to press for. We need to press for the U.S. and U.S. allies to stop supplying and arming and training terrorists in another sovereign country.
Now, let me ask you this. It looks like when, by the time Hillary Clinton's sworn in, that Assad might be gone anyway, because the Turks just rolled in, and have they changed their policy on regime change against Assad? I know their first enemy is the Kurds, and they want to push the YPG back east of the Euphrates River there. But now we have the actual Turkish army and with tanks and fighting in alliance with the so-called FSA groups, which just means Al-Qaeda. There's maybe a different branch than the guys that are pinned down in Aleppo right now, but the same groups. So I wonder if Assad's even going to make it to New Year's.
Well, I
guess maybe a better way to phrase that is, has Obama just made a deal with the Turks to not just attack the Kurds, but to attack Assad?
Well, just think back 2 weeks ago, approximately 2 weeks ago, Erdogan went to St. Petersburg and had a sit-down meeting with the Russian President Putin. And I think that set off alarm bells in Washington and in Brussels. And Erdogan is a consummate opportunist. So he's going to milk it for everything he can get right now. So but I think one thing that is probably going to happen is the indications are that Turkey is dropping its adamant opposition to Assad. There's actually substantial economic relations between Turkey and Russia, and when Russia imposed all the sanctions after Turkey shot down the Russian jet, and Russia basically, all of the Russian tourism to Turkey stopped. The Russian trade, the imports, the exports, all of the economic trade that they had stopped. And that actually did some real, they felt it in Turkey. So Erdogan's got various reasons, but he's moderating his message. And in fact, the new prime minister of Turkey just in the last week has said explicitly that Assad can be part of the transition. So, that's not saying that, it's up to the Syrian people to decide, which is the proper position to take. But their previous demand that Assad has to go before there can be any discussion or there can be a transition, that's over with. And I think to sustain some decent relations with Russia, Turkey's going to have to moderate its position. But they're milking that improvement in Turkish-Russian relations. Erdogan is milking it to get the U.S. to do things. So that's why you had Biden there in the recent days, and that's why you had the Turks working with the U.S. and you had Biden also giving the order to the Kurdish group, to the PYD, to move north of the Euphrates.
All right. Well, thanks very much for coming on the show, Rick. I see it says here at Consortium News, where your article is run in propaganda for Syrian regime change, it says you're a member of the Syrian Solidarity Movement. Is there a website you can refer us to there as well?
Yeah, it's just that name. It's www.syriasolidaritymmovement.org. Okay. And we've got like Eva Bartlett, is a member of Syria Solidarity Movement. Vanessa Beeley, we've got lots of great members. Vanessa and Eva were just in Syria. So they would actually be good ones to reach out to, Scott, when you get when the time is good.
Yeah. Sounds good. If you have an email list, please add me to it and send me what they write.
Okay. All right. Will do.
All right. Perfect. Well, thanks very much for coming on the show, Rick. I really appreciate it.
Okay. You bet, Scott. Take care.
All right. You too. All right, y'all. That's Rick Sterling, investigative journalist and member of the Syria Solidarity Movement. That's SyriaSolidarityMovement.org. And find this great article. It's really worth your time here. Propaganda for Syrian Regime Change at ConsortiumNews.com. And that's the Scott Horton Show. Thanks very much for listening, y'all. It's ScottHorton.org for the archives and for the podcast feed to sign up there. Also, follow me on Twitter. Help support at ScottHorton.org/donate. Yes, I still have Rothbard books. It doesn't say it because I can't update the page for some reason, but anybody donates $50 or more to support the Scott Horton Show and get a copy of the brand new Rothbard book, with long-lost essays from 1967 and 68. A Libertarian Looks at the 60s. Never a Dull Moment, it's called. A Libertarian Looks at the 60s. And, yeah, that's at scotthorton.org/donate. And follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. Okay, thanks, guys. See ya. Hey, I'll check out the audiobook of Lew Rockwell's Fascism versus Capitalism, narrated by me, Scott Horton, at audible.com. It's a great collection of his essays and speeches on the important tradition of liberty. From medieval history to the Ron Paul Revolution, Rockwell blasts our statist enemies, profiles our greatest libertarian heroes, and prescribes the path forward in the battle against Leviathan. Fascism versus Capitalism by Lew Rockwell for audiobook. Find it at Audible, Amazon, iTunes, or just click in the right margin of my website at scotthorton.org. Hey, y'all, Scott Horton here for WallStreetWindow.com. Mike Swanson knows his stuff. He made a killing running his own hedge fund and always gets out of the stock market before the government-generated bubbles pop, which is, by the way, what he's doing right now, selling all his stocks and betting on gold and commodities. Sign up at WallStreetWindow.com and get real-time updates from Mike on all his market moves. It's hard to know how to protect your savings and earn a good return in an economy like this. Mike Swanson can help. Follow along on paper and see for yourself. WallStreetWindow.com.